All right, we're live. Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City the Immaculata, back with you. I have kind of hit the ground running with some of these topics that I've been covering since I took my little break to move over the summer, and in keeping with our theme of let's talk about fun, casual, lighthearted subjects. I figured today we would cover an easy one: slavery in the Catholic Church. Now, just a few preliminary remarks as always. My early remarks in these end up taking a lot longer than I ever mean for them to take, but I feel like there is in this particular conversation, as with many of these ones I've been having recently, the need to make some distinctions. And the first distinction is I want to be careful with my distinctions because I find that in discourse, especially online discourse and content creators in the Catholic Church, there generally seems to be two extremes. One extreme is sort of hand waving and washing away all of the things of our past to the point that the catchword for that is these days is nuance, to the point that you see people that kind of, for the critics of this approach, nuance away all the significance of their point that they're making. And there's a danger in that. There's a danger in which you are so wanting to take the middle road that you actually end up on some other extreme that you never meant to be on. And I'm not going to name names for any of these, but there's people that you could probably guess who do this. On the other side, there are the people who just see everything in terms of black and white, and there's no amount of discrepancies or categorizing or distinctions that could convince them of the fundamental errors that they hold to positions on things such as slavery, which we're going to talk about today. And I try on this channel, fail as I might, to apply historical to apply the kind of rigor and uh, I mean nuance is kind of the word, but nuance has been so weaponized to apply the kind of nuanced, and I say that in quotes. I would have a specific definition for how I would categorize nuance, but to apply that to topics of history with the kind of rigor that sort of allows for the critiques on either side to, if it's a valid critique, if it's a logical critique of something, to stand, to address it, and to kind of proceed forward in a sort of dialectic sense that you may find in like a approach from the scholastics, right? And Thomas was famous for his approach of presenting objections to his arguments before he makes his arguments. And there's a lot of people that laud Thomas, but there's very few that actually practice his method. And I think a good reason for that is, we, and I include myself in this, oftentimes we fail as rhetoricians. I, and it's an important thing to keep in mind with rhetoric is it's one of the three principal studies of the trivium. You have grammar, you have logic, and you have rhetoric. Grammar gives you the words you need to say. Logic gives you the ability to think through. And rhetoric is the ability to articulate. St. Bonaventure says that rhetoric is the ability to place the idea that's in your mind in someone else's mind. And so sometimes we fail in our rhetoric. And I'm always trying to walk that line where I may have the proper words, I may have the proper logical conclusions, but I don't have the rhetorical abilities to be able to present it to you guys. So I'm constantly working on that. And I know that's, some of the people that I really admire in history are people that have taken this approach. Augustine, for example, is so successful, I think, in his writing and his thought because he was, many of you don't realize this, Augustine in his earlier life was a trained rhetorician. He was not simply a logician, he was a rhetorician. And that's why even when you read his Latin is so eloquent and beautiful. He's got these wonderful phrases. I think any Latinist would agree with this, even a secular one, that Augustine just has these wonderful phrases. And that comes from his ability as a rhetorician to present his ideas in a way that are convincing. So I try to keep that in mind as I'm coming together with this this topic to present to you guys because I know it's a very debated topic. I used to live in Richmond, Virginia. I was born and raised, and in Richmond, Virginia, in the United States, there are people that are still fighting the Civil War and still debating over contingent arguments around the Civil War. So I know it's still a topic that people dare to tread into in terms of actually trying to pull out the proper hermeneutics of reading the churches, especially the church's position on this. The impetus for this actually was born of a debate that my wife, I say debate, a conversation that my wife and I were having a few weeks ago on this very subject. I said something, I blurted out something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it sort of set off this conversation. And I was trying to articulate, and my whatever my statement was might not have been the best rhetorical embellishment that I could have given, but I was trying to later, draw out that there is no explicit condemnation of slavery in the Old or New Testament. And that just sort of led us down this rabbit hole conversation that I thought would be a good subject to bring to you guys today. Granted, she and I didn't fully resolve it, nor could I say that she could necessarily repeat or articulate my position on this, so I may fail again miserably here, but alas, I will try anyways. In order to do this without being completely misrepresented, since I'm not a rhetorician, I'm not St. Augustine, and I'm starting to lean no matter how much nuance your position is. The time that I've spent doing this, the couple of years that I've been making these live videos, I don't think there are certain people out there who are going to misrepresent it, or at the very least misread it, your position regardless. I had somebody tell me on Twitter the other day because of a critique that I made of a certain country and their practices that they were no longer going to listen to anything I had to say on history. But I do want to make clear as I can from the outset, for those of you in my audience who I have found to be generally and genuinely reasonable people, which is the majority of you, I want to make a few distinctions. The first and maybe most important disclaimer that I want to make right from the start is that chattel slavery is, because of its foundational flaws, I believe, intrinsically evil and is a separate thing than what we will be referring to mostly here today. Now, that term gets tossed out, but I want to make sure you know what that is. Chattel slavery, born principally, at least in modernity, out of the African slave trade, was a system that said that the slave was no different than any other piece of property, a, a horse, a cart, a wheel. It was all the same. And not only were the slaves in the South disenfranchised, no surprise there, they were also counted as three-fifths of a person. And this is for representative purposes, of course, but it's a bit of a silly example of the hypocrisy of the slaveholding class in the South. They wanted to both keep the African enslaved, but also have him counted for seats in the representative house. To accomplish this, they passed the infamous three-fifths compromise. But again, to even be able to legally do this, one had to have a foundational system that allows its citizens to be counted as less than a man, i.e., a commodity. Now, we're going to be contrasting this to the medieval feudal system, which, depending on how you view these things, how you define your terms, a medieval peasant may very well count as what you would consider an unfree man, a slave. And we'll get to that. The other aspect that I think makes modern chattel slavery intrinsically immoral is the racial element included in it. Now, it seems that in the United States, the isolation of the African as a slave class, apart from the, say, indentured servitude of the Irish, came about as a result of expediency more than any philosophical justifications. And as the African slave was more easy to identify, say, if they escaped, but the fruit of this bore actually the fruit of this philosophy just being in my opinion, just sort of an expedient route, actually bore out of it rotten fruit of racial theories that have come to haunt us to this very day. So there's that. The other disclaimer is that we will be talking about this subject in terms of its intrinsic, that is, by its nature, which means it could possibly be inadmissible in all situations. For example, abortion, right? The Catholic Church teaches there is no situation ever in history, under any circumstances, which in procuring an abortion would be permissible, excluded the other examples that a moral theologian would give you, which is technically not an abortion. The question that my wife and I were debating ultimately was whether slavery was intrinsically evil in all circumstances under all of the definitions that is sort of categorized under this one term. And with the exception of what I have said above about chattel slavery, we will be viewing it from its more common historic vantage. And even there is a difference between something being admissible in this time due to the circumstances of our own day and making it admissible in a later time due to the circumstances for others. Those of you familiar with the death penalty debate are probably aware of this distinction, right? The challenge is, and this is something I was kind of pressing my wife on, to say that all forms of slavery are immoral in all circumstances is to say that sacred scripture, the church as an institution, and even the saints engaged and permitted, and at times, for example, the saints engaged in a moral evil. And this is a problem if you want to hold the Catholic Church to the standard of whom she says she is. Now, if you want to be sort of a nominalist and something of a moral relativist who says that, these things can fluctuate, this isn't a problem for you. But for those of us that want to say that the Catholic Church is true in what she says about herself and that she cannot lead men astray, an area of faith and morals, this is a problem. To simplify it, as it seems to be the example every good Catholic understands, it's as if to say there were found examples in the Bible and church history among the saints of them procuring and performing abortions. You won't find this because foundationally there is a moral evil at play in the act that makes the act evil in all circumstances, and the church has recognized this from the very beginning, as attested to with the Didache. Slavery, on the other hand, one finds it mentioned without blanket condemnation in sacred scripture. One finds the church authorizing it at times. One even finds the saints and certain popes engaging in the practice. So, how do we make sense of all of this? First, it's important to add to the other spectrum of this, from chattel slavery to the opposite side of the spectrum, you could say, what other forms of slavery could we be mentioning historically? The problem here, I think, is that it's really an equivocation of sorts to use the word slavery to talk about all things that are all of these different practices that are not exactly related. For example, if a man owes another man a large debt and he becomes indebted to that man, he must, by law, work off that debt. By law, he's technically not free to just not pay off his debts. In fact, until very recently, we used to imprison those who would or couldn't pay off their debts in jails known as debtors' prisons. This was common practice. And this isn't just a pecuniary compensation either. The debt may have been historically paid off in terms of labor and servitude. These people were not owed their freedom. And by the general use of the word, they were enslaved to their creditors. Now, in medieval times, land was owned by a very, very small percentage of the noble class. Technically, all the land was owned by the king or the emperor, and he would partition and endow land into estates for his family, for his military officers, for his political allies. But for practical purposes, the land was overseen by the nobility. They would in turn, quote, lend the land to peasants to work and farm. Now, the peasants could farm, depending on what situation you're in and what period of time, the peasants could farm for their own sustenance, but they owed a portion of their labor and produce to the nobles. So this land, it may be just a couple strips of a cornfield. I guess not cornfield because the corn would have been introduced with maize, but like a wheat field, for example. Let's say you grow X amount of rows for your family managed X amount of rows. The next X amount of rows was owned by the was not owned, was managed by the next peasant family, and the next set, so on and so forth, until you had this large piece of property that was owned by the nobility, which was worked in strips by peasant families. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, you couldn't get together, let's just say the next family over, and say, "Hey, you know what? Let's just trade out this year. Let's just swap the land that we're tilling. I need to change the scenery. The wife likes the hill over there on your side. Let's just switch this year. Maybe we'll switch back." Like you were tied to the land that you were given, and you had to stay on it by force if need be. Now, the nobles in turn offered the land for you to work to feed yourself, and they also offered protection for the peasants. And that's another thing. You couldn't, as a peasant, you couldn't just join the military. Let's just say you were a young man, you had a taste for adventure. That was a ruling class endeavor, the knightly class. You were born into this. And it really wasn't until King Henry V, with his yeomen and their longbows and his campaign against the French, that for the first time you see actually a real change in this. But until that point, you were whatever class you were born into, and it's very, very few were born into the knights class. You were stuck in that class for your whole life, and you were stuck with that plot of land that you were told that you were going to work your whole life up until the point of King Henry V. Let's say you wanted to join the military, Mr. Bob the peasant with his little plot of land. You were never going to join the military. You were going to do what you were told. Now, there were also men and women who were captives of war. And these people too were brought into work as servants. Often after certain military campaigns, the conquerors, the captors, would take these people as rightful spoils of war. And the church at times is relatively silent on this practice. You'll notice in the account by Saint Bede of Pope Saint Gregory the Great, that wonderful little famous anecdote where he sees the English boys on the docks in Rome coming off the boat, and he's informed that they are Angli, which he replies famously, "Non Angli sed Angli, angeli." These are not angles, they are angels. The usually unnoticed thing about that little anecdote, about that tale, is that they were slaves coming off the boat. And there's no mention of the fact that they were slaves. They were probably captives of the Anglo-Saxons, who were notorious slave traders. The practice wasn't abolished in the Anglo-Saxon world until the 1100s, in fact, when the Normans invaded England. But in many respects, this was seen as the just fruits of a conquest. By right of conquest, you could be subject to servitude. But notice, though, and this is a key distinction, notice that Gregory saw these slave boys and called them angels. He didn't see these boys as chattel or property in the dehumanized sense. So keep that in the back of your mind. Now, things get really complicated when you come up into the age of discovery and sort of the modern world, right? By modern, I mean after 1492, when the New World was opened up. Now, I want to attempt in discussing this to not convolute an already convoluted topic, which is not an easy task. But before I jump into modernity, one thing I want to present here is a history of the development of some of the unique Christian ideas. And I was kind of thinking in my mind, like, where to place this part. Do I just run through the history and then talk about this, or do I talk about this and run through the history? But I think it helps moving forward to at least be aware of this. You'll often hear critics of Christianity saying, well, why did the church engage in X bad thing? You see, that's just evidence that the church is evil. She says she says thing X is bad, yet she engaged in X thing. Bad thing X happened, and the church didn't immediately drop the gauntlet and put an end to it. This bad thing continues throughout history. Now, I cannot stress enough how bad of an argument this is. Yet you see it all the time. I'm probably would hedge my bets that many of you have seen this argument bandied about by critics of church history. You have to begin making that argument by assuming that X thing is somehow intrinsically bad outside of the moral foundations laid by Christianity, which we talk about a lot on this channel. And that somehow people were just magically aware that this thing that they had knowledge magically infused into their brains that this is a moral precept. But we know that's not how things happened. It was the church herself who first noticed that X thing was evil, and then either immediately, as with the case with abortion, or over time sought to weed out this thing from society. Unfortunately, and this is just how history plays out, you can't change society in a flash. Occasionally in the past, you will see some revolutionary idea come along, and that thing kind of takes hold, and you see all of a sudden just a massive change fairly quickly. There are examples of that. And I'm trying to, like an example may be, okay. So the example of the prohibition against infanticide, for example. When the Christians came along, they said, this is evil. Unequivocally, this is evil. And the world, generally speaking, didn't have to be dragged into compliance. Most of society saw right away that they shouldn't be leaving their children out to die of exposure, as had been the custom up to that time. But that's kind of the exception. Most of the time, what happens is that the ideas form, usually by, say, a churchman. We call these the patristics or the church fathers, who are thinking about the thing, writing about it. The ideas sort of percolate out into the monasteries and out into the church. They make their way from the monasteries into the church, eventually out into the world at large. This may take decades. It may take centuries for the idea to take hold. Such is the developments around the ideas of slavery. Now, again, there's two paths that I want to follow with this, and I don't exactly know which one to go with first. Okay, well, so one of the developments that happens is that two very important thinkers, St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Augustine of Hippo, are ruminating on the implications of Christianity and the reality of the incarnation and all of these debates around person and all of these things that are being hotly discussed in the fourth century. And quite astonishingly, these two men, around the same time, at the same moment in history, which again is pretty astonishing if you think about it, they begin to express for the first time real arguments against the practice of slavery. Now, these are two very far apart, disparate places, right? You're talking about Gregor of Nyssa up in Cappadocia and Augustine down in North Africa. They were not in correspondence with one another. It's not like they were sharing notes, but they were both very deep thinkers. They were both very grace-filled men, and they were reflecting. And they came to the conclusion that slavery was actually not necessarily compatible with the Christian message. Gregory, in particular, writes in his homily on Ecclesiastes, quote, you are condemning to slavery human beings whose nature is free and characterized by free will. You are making laws that rival the law of God, overturning the law appropriate for humankind. Human beings were created specifically to have dominion over the earth. It was determined by their Creator that they should exercise authority yet you place them under the yoke of slavery, as though you were opposing and fighting against the divine decree. End quote. Augustine writes in his Questiones in Heptatuacumen that slavery is not a natural state for man to be in, and that it is a result of the punishment of the fall. Now, granted, that's not as radical as Gregory, nor as firm a condemnation as you may want to read through today's eyes, but for its time, it's still quite a monumental shift in thinking. The other development that is happening concurrent to these men thinking through the implications of all of this is the formulation of the idea of person. This is a super fascinating topic that we would have to get into at a later point, but it suffices to say that the notions of the notions around this, you can see the churchmen that are thinking through this are struggling to even come up with the proper terms. The notions of persona, prosopon, hypostasis, these were born out of the Christological debates and would later have a profound effect. It's almost impossible to stress the significance of the effect that it would later have on Western thinking. It's almost, I would say, the principal defining factor of Western thought is the some of the notions that developed around nature and person that were born out of the Christological debates. In many ways, it sort of sets the philosophy and ethics of the West that we so often take for granted from that point forward. Ideas of bodily autonomy, consent, free will, all of this comes from the idea of human individuality. And this takes a lot of time to come about and to see the church sort of getting at it piece by piece over the centuries. With the rise of consent and marriage for the validity of the sacrament to the developments of an individual's haseity in the writings that you would find of Blessed John Duns Scotus, all of these things sort of come together to this concept of you, the individual existence that you are. Now, I think it's Richard of St. I get Hugh and Richard confused, but I think it's Richard of St. Victor drawing from Boethius, who would say that a person, and is one of probably the best definitions that you'll find of this, a person was an incommunicable substance of a common nature. So while you share a common nature, the nature of man, you, the you that makes you, you, is incommunicable to the other yous that are out there. Scotus goes so far as to say that this is a mysterious this. It's a thisness that is present and known only truly to God. That's what haxeity means. It's thisness. The this that is no other this. And you don't just get these concepts form overnight. It takes a long time, even for the ideas to begin to take root, right? It's not, that process is very slow. An idea begins in the monastery in the 1100s, say. That idea is picked up by a master to students. Students who go about and can pick it up and they argue it and they refine it. Eventually, maybe a century later, it finds its way into a synod or a council, and it becomes the officially sanctioned teaching of the Catholic Church. Then it still takes years, centuries for the church to make the idea penetrate society. If it ever does at times, you still see the church struggling for some of these things. And that's actually, and that's, or even the case where you have the medieval canon lawyers, they're trying to figure out, this is the fruition of all of this comes around Lateran IV, but even before the Council of Lateran IV, you have the canon lawyers trying to determine what makes these individual sacraments valid. And they're going through all of these ideas, and many of the things that we foundationally later use, some of the ideas around marriage, for example, they have their foundation in that arguments and those refinements that you find in this period. So the ideas of individual personhood have taken root. And oh, what do you know? Here, centuries later, we have these radical men and women, oftentimes coming from the church, be it Catholic or Protestant, who began pressing for the abolishment of slavery. All slavery, leave aside just chattel slavery, they are saying that there is no longer any justification for this practice. Now, maybe there was some philosophical, just theoretical justification for this type of slavery that says, okay, you're indebted to this man for this amount of time until you've paid off restitution. But the type of slavery that is a product of conquest, of venture, etc., we can't seriously hold that up and be consistent in our morality. And that becomes the debates we end up having leading into modernity, where you really see the Catholic Church in particular beginning to grapple and wrestle with this challenge. Because it all gets complicated, going back to the history, it all gets complicated and upended when we enter the modern world because we enter this period of discovery. And what happens is that the secular powers, especially of Spain and Portugal to begin with, in order to perpetuate this business enterprise that they have undertaken, along with their own expansion and their colonial conquests, they have used, from very early on in the process, began using slavery, which increases to an unprecedented scale, and really a new type of slavery, the sort of chattel slavery that we begin to think about in terms of slavery in the modern world. And it's at this time, this is where you really see the popes and the churchmen begin hashing this out. I think one of the things you have to keep in your mind as you're weaving between all of these threads, some of the initial allowances from the popes seem to be that the popes have in their mind what had historically been. So you see certain justifications from, who is it? Is it Pope Nicholas V, which we'll get to in a minute? You may see certain historical justifications that he's making, but he doesn't have the hindsight that we have to see what this enterprise of chattel slavery is turning into. Once that starts to become clear a little bit later, then you start to see consistent condemnations. This goes with the religious orders as well. You have some Jesuits, for example, who are slave owners. Then you have others who are among the most radical opponents of the practice, existing at the same time in the same order. So it's not a cut and dry thing. So again, you have the papacy early on, you know, as this enterprise is underway, and you start to see the political machinations, especially of Spain and Portugal. It almost got to the point where they prematurely broke Europe out into the factional wars that would later take the form under the wars of religion. The Pope trying to like quell that by Alexander VI famously offering his his latitudinal compromise from the doctrine of discovery, where he gives he gives a portion of the New World to Portugal and a portion to Spain, which is why you get Brazil, for example, speaks Portuguese today. But there are people that are out there that are arguing against the practice as it's really starting to take shape. And even when you finally have Spain condemn it with their, what is it called? The new laws, I believe. You still have unscrupulous men who are engaged in trafficking humans for profit for many, many decades, long after it was outlawed. Now, to kind of show you how tricky this is, I want to give you this example. It's an earlier example. This is Pope Nicholas V, 1397 to 1455. So he's attempting to intervene between these near 1397, that's his life. I'm sorry, that's not his papacy. He's attempting to intervene between the near war outbreaking between Spain and Portugal. So he says, as they jockeyed for hegemony along the west coast of Africa, threatening peace and the stability of Europe, in the papal bull Romanus Pontifex, he grants perpetual rights of slavery, stating, this is the quote, we, therefore, weighing all in singular the premises with due mediation, and noting that since we had formerly by other letters of ours granted among other things free and ample faculty to the aforesaid King Alfonso to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, whosoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, etc., and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, etc., by having secured the said faculty, the king, or by his authority, the aforesaid infant, justly and lawfully has acquired, possessed, and does possess these lands, islands, harbors, seas, etc. So you can see, Pope Nicholas is basing that on what had previously been. Now, not very long after this, you have Pope Paul III. Now, Pope Paul III, keep in mind, by this point, the Reformation has happened. Europe is falling apart. Pope Paul III is one of the first. I think he actually is Pope Paul III. He might have been the one that first convened the Council of Trent. So this is a reforming pope. He's got Reformation in mind. He is reading about what's happening. Few decades later, this is what he has to say about the subject. So coming out of this reports about the corruption and the brutal treatment of the Indians in the New World, the Pope says, quote, the said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or their possessions of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and have no effect. So, you begin to see the papacy's ideas taking shape. As well, you have, as I mentioned, the Jesuits and others taking part actively in the slave markets and the owning thereof. But then you also have men like St. Peter Claver, who was notorious in his own day, a saint in our day, notorious in his day, who would intervene on behalf of the slaves, sometimes quite drastically. You have Bartolomé de las Casas, who was criticized for his propaganda in defense of the Indians and the opposition to slavery, that his critics would say that he distorted the historical accounts at times in his writings, but nonetheless, he's a servant of God, and like St. Peter Claver, was radical in his opposition to slavery, at least by the standards of his own day. Later, you have men like St. Charles let me say it's French. He's one of my heroes, so I should be able to say his name like this. Lavegere, St. Charles Lavegere. And his white fathers, they were named the white fathers because they would wear these long white robes, habits, not because their skin was white. They were actively involved in opposition to the slave trade in Africa. So you see, especially in the modern world, especially as this form of slavery begins to take a more violent, brutal turn, a more dehumanizing turn, eventually culminating in the racial chattel slavery of the United States, a general abhorrence of the practice coming from Rome and the church at large more consistently. But it's still a very strained history, and not all is clear as we'd maybe like it to be. And look, I don't come here telling you what you want to hear. I'm here to bring the history to you. Like I said, I had somebody tell me the other day, because I criticized the government of Israel, that they were never going to listen to anything I had to say about history again. I am, if nothing else, I'm consistent in my if I can be persuaded into a different position, I'm more than willing to be, but I'm consistent in my positions overall. I have been a critic of that particular government for many, many years, well over a decade at this point. And, these kinds of positions that I have, if at times they come across as sharp or biting or controversial, nuanced, it's probably a failure on my own part in my rhetorical ability to present, as Bonaventure would say, to take the idea that's in my mind and put it in your mind. But I'm trying, and I am consistent, if nothing else. I think this particular history can be worked out. Generally speaking, I think there is a type of servitude that may have at one time been permissible, though it could never deny the humanity of said servant. I think that there is also a general distrust, a general aversion from very early on in the church against this very common practice that you see the world over. And the critique of it comes uniquely from Christians. Now, you don't get an anti slavery Christian movement from the very early centuries of the church, but it's not outside of a Christian context that you get any critique of it whatsoever. I think we can and we ought to condemn practices of slavery as they begin to morph into the modern period, certainly. And as the ideas of person and autonomy begin to take shape over the centuries, and as the church begins to make her pronouncements on these matters, we can begin to say confidently that there is, for example, no situation in which a human being should be considered less than a human being or a piece of property like you would own a chair or a microphone or a laptop. Same time, I don't think that we can outright condemn all instances of this thing that we blanket call slavery in all instances. I do think that to do so, Catholics would be treading into territory that undermines her authority as the Church Christ instituted, because it is a matter of morals. But even, even in the most complicated of times, I think the Catholic Church has done her part to make the proper distinctions, even if her followers, even if individual Catholics at times have failed to heed her pronouncements. The Church has maintained her integrity in this matter, I believe. And one thing I think that we could probably most of us could agree on is that it was the Church, it was the Christians that once again did the work of pulling humanity, including slaves, out of the filthy existence that she found herself in. No one else gets credit for this. No one else should get credit for this. Not the Muslims, not the Buddhists. Now, there are many groups that came along after the fact, but trace their arguments against slavery from our own, right? We were the ones that really got the ball rolling. So that's really all I've got for you today, coming up to about 50 minutes. Let's see. Azul, in regard to the history of slaves in the Portuguese Empire, I recommend the following. And I imagine there's something incoming, a recommendation. I don't know as much about the Portuguese. I know a little bit more about the Spanish. Once you start getting into modernity, that's when I start to get a little bit iffy about my history. But I do know that with the situation with the Spanish, and it's probably almost identical to the Portuguese, is very, very, very complex. I don't know how much I want to spend on this, but for example, you have different expeditions have different purposes and different outcomes, different men leading them. Online right now, it's all the rage among Catholic circles to depict these images of the conquistadors um, coming in to overthrow the Aztec Empire. And I think that is arguably a good thing, right? I think you would have to have it. You'd have to be a pretty morally relativistic person to argue that it wasn't a good thing that the Aztec Empire was overthrown. Most of the Mexicans at the time, the other tribes would have agreed that the Aztec Empire needed to be overthrown. So, at the same time, you should read Bernard, what is it? The Conquest of New Spain, one of the conquistadors' own diaries and journals of the expedition. There were some shady things that happened. More challenging than I think the situation with the Aztec, who I think were pretty clear. It's pretty black and white with the Aztec that they were and that they were involved in pretty demonic practices. Less clear, I think, less laudable and often not brought up because in these memes, the memes that I've seen going around are, pictures of the Aztec cutting out people's hearts and saying, it's a good thing that this is gone, right? The other thing that they don't make memes of is Pizarro's conquest of the Incan Empire, because the Incan Empire was actually a fairly peaceful empire. And the Pizarro expedition, he was not so concerned with the souls of the people that he was conquering. He was way more concerned with the um, troves of gold that they had stored. And the conquest of the Incans was actually a bit atrocious. As well, once the conquistadors settle, at first the Spanish government is very involved in enslaving the Indians. It gets very convoluted very quickly, but the Spanish government is involved in the practice of the slave trade. But they're finding that the Incan Indians, the Amazonian Indians, that the natives are not they good slaves they do not make. They tend to be given more towards leisure than work. So that's how the African slave trade really began to open up because there was consistently better workers that you could mine from the conquests of the African tribes and bring them over into the New World, and they would be way more quote unquote productive for your company. Spanish government's all behind this. Eventually, there's enough pressure. Really, the pressure begins from the church, from the missionaries that are over in the New World who are writing back against these practices, and then the church in the New World. I mean, the church in the Old World really putting pressure on the Spanish government. The Spanish government finally passes the new laws, but by that point, the the Spanish that and the Portuguese that are left in South America, they're kind of like, who are you to tell us what to do? Right? It's not unlike a situation what you find in the United States, the wood and the colonies, right, where they begin to tell the old country, who are you to tell us what to do? So even as you see Spain start to pass laws against the practice of enslaving the natives, the people that are there engaged in it aren't necessarily listening. And it's often through violence that the practice is ended much later. Like you get the Haitian Revolution with Toussaint Louverture, who was a Catholic, mind you. It was a shame that he wasn't more successful. And then all the way up until the modern world, you get in the 20th century, which I wrote about in the book that I have coming out on the Putumayo massacres in the Amazon. So these things are and the enslavement of the Amazonians by these sort of robber barons. I don't see as Azul. I don't see your book coming through, but if you leave it in the comments later, always interested in a good recommendation of history. So I appreciate you guys following this one. Hopefully, I've made some sense of it. I didn't resolve the problem. Hopefully, I've made some sense of it. I didn't resolve it with my wife either. She sees these things in a very black and white terms, which is fine. I mean, I think we should. How do I want to say this? The world that we live in today, I think slavery is taken on, especially in the quote unquote first world, slavery has taken on a different form. I think modern slavery is incurred through the debts that young people take on, and they remain indebted, enslaved their whole lives. And I think that these things should be consistently fought in the same way that we fought the more explicit forms of slavery in the past. Though it takes us time to work these things out. You see some you see some leeway given to the ancient practice of usury. The church is kind of given some leeway on some modern, would you say, usurious practices, where I think we actually need to have moral theologians. And this is kind of actually where I ended the conversation. Moral theologians who mainly seem to live in their ivory towers and argue with one another, that we need them in the trenches. We need them out here fighting the battles for us, because it shouldn't be on my wife to have to determine the moral historical validity of something like slavery. It shouldn't even be on the average Catholic to have to justify all the nuances of contraception, right? Like, we're out here trying to do it, arguing with Catholics. Catholics are tearing each other apart over these moral issues, because I think that the moral theologians who actually retain and have the answers to these things are not doing a very good job rhetorically of getting the message from their own minds, the ideas from their own minds to our minds. Moral theology is an area that I don't really, if you go back through this channel, I don't cover moral theology very often, because It's one of the areas that of my least area of expertise, and I wish that there were some more common pop apologetic level moral theologians who were out there really in the trenches doing the hard work for us of helping answer some of these questions and some of these challenges that we have. So, anyways, guys, that's all I have for today. As you can see, I jokingly said at the beginning it was going to be a lighthearted topic. I promise next time is going to be a lighthearted topic. I'm going to cover, can you survive as a medieval? And I've got a few fun ideas of some challenges that I want to present to you of what medieval life was like, and let you decide for yourself if it is a challenge that you would be willing to undertake for the average life of the average Catholic in the medieval world. So, could you survive as a medieval? Tune in for that next time. Take care, guys. God bless.